everyone. I hope you can hear me, and thank you for joining the webinar today. My name is Nick Lamb. I'm the Managing Director for Morgan McKinley here in Hong Kong. We're delighted to welcome Bart Basens to present today's Success Series webinar, which will be on state-of-the-art credit risk analytics. Today, Bart will talk about credit risk analytics, and more specifically about Level 0, data, Level 1, the model, and Level 2, ratings and calibration. Bart is a professor from KU Leuven in Belgium and a lecturer at the University of Southampton. He's done extensive research on analytics, customer relationship management, web analytics, fraud detection, and credit risk management. His findings have been published in well-known international journals and presented at many international conferences. He is the author of books Credit Risk Management, Basic Concepts, which was published by the Oxford University Press, and Analytics in a Big Data World, published by Wiley. Before we start, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping tips. We will be recording this webinar, which will be available in the next few days on our website, and we will also send you the link by email. If you have any questions, they will be taken by the chat feature on your webinar control panel at the end of the presentation. Please also join the conversation on Twitter at Morgan McKinley using hashtag Success Series and hashtag Career Ally. We hope you enjoy the webinar today, and now I'm delighted to introduce Bart. Hello, Bart.
Thanks, Nick, for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. I would say good morning, good afternoon, hopefully not good night, from wherever you're joining. My name is Bart Basens, and today we're going to talk about the state-of-the-art in credit risk analytics. I'll maybe briefly start by introducing myself. Nick already did it, but let me just highlight a few more issues. So I studied at the Catholic University of Leuven, which is in Belgium, and this is also the place where I'm situated right now. Leuven is a very small city in Belgium. It's close to Brussels. It's about 20 kilometers away from Brussels. It's known for having the best university of the country, which is pretty obvious because that happens to be the place where I work. And it's also known for having lots of beers, right? Belgium is known for beers, and there's a lot of beers which are being exported, and one of the beers that is very popular outside Belgium is a beer called Stella Artois. Now this beer is being brewed about a couple of hundreds of meters away from the place I am at right now. This is not the best Belgian beer though. Stella Artois is definitely not the best Belgian beer. Both Belgians don't like it. That's probably one of the reasons why we export it that much, right? Unfortunately, this course is, or this seminar is not about beers, but it's about credit risk modeling. So I did a PhD on the topic of credit scoring using machine learning techniques, which I finished in 2003. If you would like to have a copy of my PhD, just send me an email. I'm very happy to send it to you as a PDF. Actually, I'll be very pleased that finally someone shows some interest in my work. Currently, I'm a professor at the KU Leuven in Belgium, and I'm a lecturer at the School of Management of the University of Southampton in the UK. My research is analytics and anything that is related to that. So we study analytics primarily in a credit risk setting, but we also study it for fraud detection, for marketing analytics, etc. If you want to have an overview of all the research that we're doing in the area of analytics, feel free to connect on my YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter account. The name is Data Mining Apps. On my YouTube account, you will actually find some movies discussing some of our most recent research findings. Also, feel free to have a look at our website, dataminingapps.com, where you will find all our research tracks, some further explanation, and some key papers that we published on the topic, and also links to videos. Feel free to send me an email as well in case you would like to have some further follow-up information at the end of the presentation. So here you can see the overview of today's presentation. We're going to start with a brief introduction situating the importance of credit risk modeling. Then we're going to decompose credit risk into various components. We're going to talk about PD, LGD, and EAD. That will bring us to a multi-level credit risk model architecture. Then we're going to discuss various challenges that come with working out the architecture. We're going to talk about data quality. We're going to talk about credit risk model requirements. We're going to talk about the distinction between model discrimination and model calibration, which is a huge challenge in credit risk modeling, if you ask me. We're going to talk about model monitoring, model validation, backtesting, benchmarking, and then we're going to finish with some conclusions. At the end of my presentation, I will also give you a very brief demo of an e-learning course that I have been developing on the topic. Let's start with the introduction. Well, credit risk models are very important these days. Why? Because they more and more steer the strategic decisions of banks. The outcome of the credit risk models are being directly used by banks and financial institutions to decide upon the buffer and equity capital. And we want to make sure that a bank is well capitalized, because if a bank is not well capitalized, it's going to bring us, savings depositors, into problems. In other words, the minimum equity or buffer that a bank holds are directly being determined by credit risk models, but not only credit risk models, also market risk models. And when I say market risk, I'm referring to liquidity risk, commodity price risk, interest rate risk, etc. Not only market risk models, but also operational risk models, fraud risk models, and so on. So all of these types of risks are being directly quantified by means of big data and analytics. So we better make sure that our data is of good quality and our analytical models are of good quality as well. Now, these analytical models are being more and more subject to regulation. I'm sure you have heard about Basel II, Basel III, and Solvency II. In essence, all these capital accords are analytical accords. These accords thoroughly discuss what are the inputs of the analytical models and how the outputs should be defined. They also discuss how the various outputs should be combined in order to determine capital and provisions. So if we make errors in our analytical models, then the impact of those errors is now bigger than ever before. Model errors, in other words, are going to directly affect profitability, solvency, shareholder value, and the macroeconomy as a whole. So again, analytics is having a huge impact in today's business environment. One of these models is credit risk models, and that's the focus of today's talk. And when I say credit risk, you need to decompose credit risk into various credit risk components. We have three credit risk components that play a crucial role. The first one is the probability of default, often abbreviated as PD. That's the probability of default of a counterparty over a one-year period as it has been defined by regulation worldwide. And when I say regulation worldwide, I'm referring to a regulation that has been introduced by the Basel Committee, the BIS, the Basel Committee that introduced the Bank of International Settlements situated in Basel in Switzerland. Probability of default is a probability that's really very important to be aware of. Hence, it's a number between 0 and 1. It's not the same as a credit score. A credit score can be any number. A credit score can even be negative. In contrast to that, a probability always ranges between 0 to 1. So one of the key challenges here is how we're going to map credit scores to probabilities of default. A second important parameter is the LGD, stands for loss given default. That's also measured in a decimal way. It is defined as follows. It's the ratio of the loss on an exposure due to default of a counterparty to the amount outstanding. It's also a parameter that should be estimated using analytics. The exposure at default is measured in currency terms. It represents the amount outstanding. Usually, this is a parameter that does not need to be estimated, since you can just look at the amount outstanding of a mortgage loan or other installment loan. However, if you have off-balance sheet credit exposures like credit cards or credit lines, then the exposure at default is usually quantified by means of a credit conversion factor, or CCF. The credit conversion factor, or CCF, then represents how much of the unused credit is likely to be converted into credit upon default. These are three key risk parameters, and they are then combined to quantify both the expected and the unexpected loss. The expected loss represents the long-term average loss. It can just be found by multiplying the PD and the LGD and the EAD. The unexpected loss is quantified according to a formula which has been written down in the Basel Accords. The formula essentially implements a VAR, a value at risk model, which takes the PD, the LGD, and the EAD and combines them to calculate the unexpected loss. We're not going to zoom into that formula in today's webinar. The only thing you need to know about this formula at this very moment is that the formula is linear in terms of LGD and EAD. So any change in LGD and EAD gives you a similar change in terms of unexpected loss and capital. Mind that the expected loss should be covered by provisions of the financial institutions, whereas the unexpected loss should be covered by Basel capital, regulatory capital, or equity, as we refer to it. You can see this visualized in the figure at the bottom right here. Let's zoom into PD and LGD modeling at the moment. Well, actually, the way the risk parameters, and here I'm not talking only about PD, LGD, but also about EAD, the way those three risk parameters are often modeled is according to a three-layer model architecture. Level 0 has the data. And when we say data, we're talking about internally collected data, data that has been collected by the bank or financial institution internally itself. We're talking about external data, data from credit bureaus, for example, data from companies such as Equifax, Experian, Dun & Bradstreet. For those of you joining us from Australia, data gathered from Vita, etc. And we have expert judgment. Expert judgment is qualitative data. It's based upon the expert's common sense, based upon the expert's business experience. Expert judgment data is very important data to help us steer the analytical models in the right direction. It's also very important to validate the findings afterwards. So this is level 0. Level 0 is the data and the data pre-processing. And when we say data pre-processing, we are referring to outlier detection, outlier treatment, missing values, categorization, weights of evidence coding, information filtering, etc. The data that we pre-processed at level 0 is then fed to level 1. At level 1, we're going to create the model. And in a PD context, this will be an application scorecard or a behavioral scorecard. An application scorecard is a scorecard that is being used to score new credit applications, to decide upon whether you're going to grant the mortgage, grant the credit card, yes or no. A behavioral scorecard is a scorecard that is being constructed for ongoing monitoring. So once the customer has entered your credit population, you will monitor their repayment behavior by means of a behavioral scorecard. Typically, both an application and a behavioral scorecard are being constructed using logistic regression. Logistic regression is one of the most widely used scorecard building techniques in the industry. I've been teaching courses in Australia, Hong Kong, in many places in Asia and Europe and the United States, and everywhere you see logistic regression being used to build application scorecards and behavioral scorecards. Now these scorecards give you scores, and a score is a number that allows you to rank order your obligors in terms of their default risk. A score can be any number. The focus of scoring is to discriminate the risky obligors from the non-risky obligors using a continuous score. As I already mentioned, the score can even be negative. However, as we said before, in a regulatory capital environment imposed by Basel, you do not only need a score, but you need a probability. You need a probability of default. So the scores should be mapped to risk ratings, also referred to as default ratings, which should subsequently be accompanied by probabilities of default. This is what happens at level 2. At level 2, we're going to define the ratings and calibrate the risk measures. This multi-level architectural framework is a framework that you typically see being adopted for PD modeling, but also for LGD and EAD modeling. It actually facilitates the whole modeling exercise. In fact, we do not only use it for modeling, but we will also use it for validation. If I will be talking about backtesting later on, then backtesting means model monitoring, seeing whether our models perform well, yes or no. Backtesting can be situated at level 0, where you're going to backtest the data stability. It can be situated at level 1, where you're going to backtest the model discrimination. And it can be situated at level 2, where you're going to backtest the calibration of the PD measures. So this is an architecture which we can not only use for modeling, but also for backtesting, also for benchmarking, and in fact also for stress testing. You can stress test the data at level 0, you can stress test the model at level 1, and you can stress test the ratings and the calibration at level 2. Here you can see some PD performance benchmarks that we obtain in our research. As I already said, when we do PD modeling, you can make a distinction between application and behavioral credit scoring. Application credit scoring, remember, focuses on deciding upon the creditworthiness of new credit applications. Behavioral credit scoring focuses on monitoring the credit risk of your current portfolio. You can also see LGD included. Now some of you may think, do these studies refer to a corporate or retail portfolio? Well, actually, it doesn't matter. We've used both corporate and retail portfolios in our benchmarking studies. In application scoring, we found that the average application scorecard has about 10 to 15 characteristics. When we say characteristics, I'm referring to predictors such as age, income, number of years client, number of years with current employer, and so on. The performance of those application scorecards typically ranges between 70 to 85%. When I say performance, I'm referring to the area under the ROC curve. This is a key performance metric which banks have to report according to their local regulators. For behavioral credit scoring, we have a similar number of characteristics. I would say between 10 to 15. The area under the ROC performance metric is somewhat higher because we have a lot more data available. In fact, the area under the ROC curve will range between 80 to 90%. Now the story is somewhat different for LGD. The average number of characteristics that we witness in an LGD model is somewhere around 6 to 8. Here I'm talking about characteristics such as loan-to-value ratio, LTV, degree of collateralization, and also a measure of default risk. Most of the times in a loss model or an LGD model, you will see a measure of default risk popping out. The performance is usually quantified by means of R-squared. R-squared is a metric that allows you to measure the performance in case you have a continuous target. As opposed to PD, for LGD, the results are a little bit more disappointing because the R-squared usually varies between 20 to 30%. This is not a lot, and in fact, it's worrying. Why is it worrying? It's worrying because remember, I told you that LGD has a linear impact on capital. So it has a bigger influence on capital than PD. And the frustrating thing here is that we are very good at PD prediction, we are very good at predicting default, but we're not very good at loss forecasting at LGD prediction. So that's worrying. So how can we improve the performance of our analytical PD and our analytical LGD models? Well, there are two strategies that we can adopt. We can work on the model or we can work on the data. Let's first follow the strategy of working on the model. Well, if we work on the model, we can make use of neural networks, support vector machines, or random forests. These are very complex nonlinear models, very hard to understand. They are very powerful because those models typically have a universal approximation property. That means that they can approximate any function to any desired degree of accuracy over a compact interval. That makes them very attractive. However, there's a loss of interpretability. It is very hard to see how the inputs contribute to the output. It's very hard to see how the inputs contribute to the PD, LGD, and EAD, and so on. So most regulators, think about the ARPA, Australian Regulation and Prudential Authority, the Monetary Authority in Singapore, think about the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Most of these regulators will be reluctant to approve those techniques. Have I seen neural networks support vector machines being used in credit risk modeling? I've seen them being used occasionally in credit risk modeling, but always in a white box setup. I cannot discuss in this course how you can do this, but I discuss it in some of my other courses in case you would be interested. There are ways of opening up the neural networks and support vector machine black box, but they are not that straightforward. So actually, most of the times, they're not being used for credit risk modeling. So a better strategy could be not to focus on the model, but to focus on the key ingredient of the model, and the key ingredient of the model is the data. We should invest in data, and more specifically in external data. Think about a FICO score or a bureau score, a VITA score, for example, in Australia. A bureau score is a score that reflects the creditworthiness of your customers developed by a credit bureau, such as Equifax, Experian, Vita, etc. In the United States, there's a well-known bureau score which is referred to as the FICO score, which has been extremely popular in credit risk modeling. Also, data quality is important. If we focus on data, on external data and data quality, then the model is still interpretable because we just changed the ingredients and we can keep on working with a simple model such as logistic regression. The disadvantage is that we need additional resources. So let's focus on the second strategy. Data quality is very important because of the GIGO principle. Anyone heard of GIGO before? Well, I'm sure many of you have. GIGO stands for garbage in, garbage out. Messy data gives you messy models. So it's very important that we safeguard our data quality. Also, because we found throughout our research that in many cases, simple analytical models perform really well. So the biggest performance increase that you can get comes from the data. When I say simple models, what am I referring to? For PD modeling, I'm referring to logistic regression and decision trees. For LGD modeling, I am referring to linear regression and regression trees. These are simple models that I'm referring to. Hence, it is really important to increase the performance of those, increase their quality by means of investing in data. Hence the importance of master data management and data quality programs. To summarize, the best way to improve the performance of a PD, LGD, and actually also an EAD model is not that much by looking for fancy tools or techniques, but to improve data quality first. If I say data quality, then data quality is a very vague concept. And at the end of the day, you need to operationalize it. You can consider data quality from various dimensions. Undoubtedly, the most important dimension of data quality is data accuracy. Here, we are referring to unusual observations, extreme values, or outliers. And when dealing with outliers, you have to be very careful because defining an outlier is not that easy. Age is 300 years is definitely an outlier. That cannot be true. Something's wrong there. Income is 1 million euros is maybe an extreme observation, but not necessarily invalid. If you have a rich person, then income 1 million euros could be a valid observation. Not only data accuracy, but data completeness. What about missing values? Missing information can be relevant information. I did not give you my income because I'm unemployed. It means income is missing, but being unemployed is risky. It's important to notice if you're doing PD or LGD modeling. Data definition. How are we going to define the data? LGD. In my credit risk modeling course, we spent one day discussing LGD modeling. The time horizon, how to include indirect costs, what about direct costs, what discount factor to use, etc. And then we also have a bunch of other dimensions such as data bias, data recency, data latency, and so on. I have a PhD student who did some work on the topic, and here you can see the various data quality dimensions that we have considered in our research. I'm not going to go through them one by one. I'm just going to highlight some categories. So you can see to the left we have some categories relating to intrinsic data quality, contextual data quality, representation, access, and so on. Obviously, some of these data quality dimensions are overlapping, but it is important to make sure that data is accurate, objective, of good reputation, complete, etc. And we did a survey with some of the banks worldwide, more than 50 banks, and actually also some Asian banks were included. And the focus was on credit risk analytics. And the main findings of our survey were that most banks indicated that between 10 to 20% of the data suffer from data quality problems. This is quite a lot if you know that this data is being used for PD and LGD modeling. One of the key problems was manual data entry. Also, the diversity of data sources and a consistent corporate-wide data representation was a main challenge. If we asked banks, why do you invest in data quality? Then the answer we got was because of regulatory compliance. Not that much because of competitive advantage, but because of regulatory compliance. Because the Basel Accords impose banks to invest in data quality. Data quality is a very tricky problem because in the short term, there's not much that you can do about it. There are only two ways that you can cope with data qualities in the short term. The first way is a statistical way. That means that you're going to diagnose data quality and you're going to treat it. You're going to diagnose the outliers and you're going to treat the outliers. And there exist various schemes to appropriately deal with outliers, such as capping procedures or other imputation procedures. If it's really bad in the short term, you would have to rely on external data. Data that has been gathered by data poolers. In the long term, it is important that you completely redesign your data entry processes, make sure that we have appropriate validation constraints, referential integrity constraints, and make sure that we set up programs for master data management. What are the requirements then of a good PD, LGD, and EAD model? Well, first of all, statistical performance. The model should have good discrimination. And you can measure that in various ways. In my credit risk modeling course, we spent like 2 hours just talking about how to accurately quantify the performance of a PD, LGD, and EAD model. But models should not only have good performance, they should also be interpretable and justifiable. All the models, all the PD, LGD, and EAD models that you guys will be developing will be validated by your local supervisors. And some supervisors take their job very seriously. I've heard of some supervisors in certain countries that actually completely redevelop the model to see whether you did a good job, yes or no. Interpretability and justifiability is a key requirement here. Also, operational efficiency. How much effort is needed to evaluate, monitor, and retrain the models? Economical cost is also a key concern. What is the accompanying cost of gathering the inputs, maybe buying them elsewhere, pre-processing them, and running them through the model? And finally, regulatory compliance is also important. The model should be in line with regulation, as it has been opposed by Basel or solvency. I already told you the difference between model discrimination and model calibration. Model discrimination is what we are concerned with at level 1 of our credit risk model architecture. Here, we want to do credit scoring, application or behavioral scoring. We want to assign high scores to the good customers, low scores to the bad customers. However, scoring is no longer sufficient because Basel II imposes an extra layer on top, which is the calibration. We should have ways of mapping the scores to well-calibrated probabilities of the events taking place. In our case, the event is default. There exist various ways of mapping scores to well-calibrated probabilities. And by doing so, it is of crucial importance that we also bring the macroeconomy into the model. Because obviously, the macroeconomy, as quantified by GDP, inflation, unemployment rates, will have an impact on our model. Here you can see that to the left illustrated. To the left you see a traditional scorecard, age, gender, and salary. This is an application scorecard. And note that in certain countries you cannot include age and gender in your scorecard. So there's some national regulation there concerning privacy and ethics about what characteristics you can include, yes or no. So to the left we have an application scorecard. To the right we have a rating. A rating is a grouping of people, a grouping of obligors which are similar in terms of default risk. And for that rating we then have the historical default rate depicted. You can see that historical default rate varies between 2 to 4%. Here you can see the historical default rate, and if we do calibration, we have to decide how we are going to extrapolate in the future. Are we going to go for a downturn scenario and follow the red dots? Or are we going to go for an upturn scenario and follow the green dots, or are we going to go for a scenario in between? So the question here is how we can move from the left, from these scores, how we can move to ratings and corresponding default rates and PDs. Well, the first way to do that is by clustering our scorecard outputs into pools. Those pools in Europe are often referred to as ratings. In the United States, they are often referred to as segments. Many Asian countries use the term pools. A pool or a rating is a homogeneous grouping of obligors in terms of default risk. We do that because our scores are too fine granular. They're too much detailed. And the pools can be defined in various ways. It's essentially what we refer to as a semi-supervised learning exercise. We can define it by mapping onto an agency rating scale, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch, or by using decision trees. Decision trees are a very handy tool to map scores into pools. And once we have mapped our scores into pools, we need to calibrate an event probability. A PD model, or an LGD, or an EAD model, we're going to do that using time series analysis techniques, dynamic models, Markov chains, simulations, and so on. That will allow us to actually create the pools, and then we can have an idea about the volatility of the pools, about how volatile the ratings are. Rating volatility is directly reflected to the rating philosophy. And you have two broad types of rating philosophies, being point-in-time, PIT, or through-the-cycle, TTC. A point-in-time rating philosophy means that your ratings measure credit risk during a particular point in time. So your ratings are very volatile. A through-the-cycle rating philosophy means that your ratings are going to measure default risk throughout a credit cycle and are more stable in time. Both can be quantified by looking at the pools and how stable they are. Here you can see our model architecture. So remember, level 0, the data, level 1, the scorecard or discrimination. Level 2 brings the macroeconomy into the game and is going to allow us to see how the macroeconomy influences our PD, LGD, and EAD models. A side benefit of this multi-level model architecture is that it becomes very easy to do stress testing. Stress testing can be done using sensitivity analysis, whereby we're going to see what happens to our LGDs if the loan-to-value ratios are going to increase by 10%. This would be an example of a sensitivity stress test at level 0, the data level. Or we can also do a sensitivity stress test at level 1, when we assume that our application or behavioral scores are going to drop by 5%. Or we can also do a sensitivity stress test at level 2, when we assume that all PDs are going to increase by 10%. We can also do scenario analysis, hypothetical or historical, or we could mimic a 1 out of 25 years event. There seems to be more and more consensus in the industry nowadays that a stress scenario corresponds to a 1 out of 25 years event. Obviously, there are many challenges that come with stress testing. I'm sure I don't have to convince you about that. Like lack of historical data, correlations breaking down during periods of stress. We should integrate the risk across the various credit risk portfolios, etc. Our models will never be perfect, right? You can see a statement from George Box, well known for the box plot, saying that all models are wrong but some are useful. Our models approximate reality, but they will never be perfect. Some are actually very bad. Think about LGD models where the R-squared is only between 20 to 30%. So how are we going to deal with this? If we have bad data quality or maybe bad model quality, then we have to calibrate our parameters in a conservative way. For LGD, this is often referred to as economic downturn calibration. If we assume that the LGD is 10%, then we're going to put it to 15% or maybe even 20% to deal with the fact of imperfect data quality and model risk. The question is how much margin you should add to your PD, LGD, and EAD measurements in order to compensate for imperfect data and model risk. And also here, there are some approaches that can be followed. Model monitoring is also very important. Why do our models degrade in performance? In order to set up model monitoring frameworks, you have to carefully diagnose the various reasons why models may degrade in performance. It could be due to sample effects, because the models were based upon limited samples. It could be due to macroeconomic effects or even internal effects. So our models need to be constantly monitored. When we say monitoring, there are various types of monitoring. There's quantitative monitoring that refers to backtesting and benchmarking. There's qualitative monitoring that refers to data quality, model design, documentation, corporate governance, and management oversight. Backtesting is a very important model monitoring activity. So here you can see it's a very simplified example. We got 4 ratings, and here you can see the estimated PD that comes out of our model, the number of observations that we have witnessed in each of the rating categories or pools, and the number of defaults. So for rating A, backtesting would mean that we have to contrast the default rate of 1.7% with the PD of 2%. Various test statistics can be used for this purpose. But when you have a test statistic, you have to adopt a confidence level. And some regulators, like the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, have given some very specific input. Hong Kong Monetary Authority, for example, advocates confidence levels of 95 or 99.9%. Here you can see some various backtesting examples. These are all based upon traffic light indicator approaches, indicating here whether you have data stability, right? This is a system stability index. Here whether you have model stability based upon the area under the ROC curve, or the accuracy ratio, which is closely related to that, which can then be monitored in time. Backtesting allows you to come up with a diagnosis, but it's not going to allow you to specify what to do in response to what action, in response to what finding. So the whole model monitoring or backtesting exercise should be accompanied by action plans telling you what to do in case your model is no longer appropriately calibrated, or in case your model is no longer providing adequate performance at level 1. Okay. Good. Key lessons learned from this very short webinar. You see there's a lot to mention here, and I have to briefly go through the topics, lessons I want you to learn are that the best way to improve the performance of a PD-LGD EAD model is not by looking for complex models, but by improving data quality first. A good model does more than giving good statistical performance. We also had operational efficiency, interpretability, economical cost, and regulatory compliance. Discrimination and calibration is also very important. Bring the macroeconomy into the model. We also introduced the idea of model risk, model validation, and action plans. In case you want some further information, here you can see some references. You can find them all on my dataminingapps.com website. Here you can see 2 books that I've written on the topic. And to conclude, I also would like to give you a very brief, like a 3 to 4 minute overview of a course that I've been developing on the topic. We can then have a discussion afterwards to address some of your questions. So about 6 months ago, we started to develop a course called Credit Risk Modeling, which is available as e-learning worldwide. So it means you can take it whenever you want at your own pace. It's about 22 hours of videos, demos, scripts, and quizzes, whereby we focus on the modeling concepts and methodology. It's not a software course, but it's offered by SAS because I often partner with SAS to teach courses. You only need a laptop, iPad, with a web browser to run the course, and you get 1 year unlimited access to all course material. I'm just going to show you an example. So here you can see the screen of the course, Credit Risk Modeling using SAS, and then you can start it. And to the left here you can see all the lessons. Every lesson consists of a couple of videos. You can see for lesson 2, this is the Basel Accords. Here we have videos of 4 minutes, 2 minutes, discussing all the Basel Accords, right? Let me just click on one of them. This is audio. You can play it whenever you want, right? During 1 year.
Basically, there are 3 approaches available, as already discussed. Standardized approach, foundation, weighted-based approach.
Okay, so here we have lessons on credit scoring, the Basel Accords, level 0, remember, preparing the data for credit scoring, classification for credit scoring, how to measure the performance using state-of-the-art techniques like ROC curves, CAP curves, lift curves, how to compute the KS distance. We also have some lessons on defining default ratings. This is level 2 using the semi-supervised learning exercise I referred to earlier. There's also some SAS demos every now and then, but SAS is not the focus of the course. It's really on the methods and the concepts. Here you can see how we define ratings, the methods we discuss. There's also questions in between to actually check whether you understood, yes or no. At the end of every lesson, there's a quiz that you can take, right, which is just going to ask you a couple of questions here. We cover PD, LGD, EAD modeling, also validation, working with low default portfolios, and stress testing. And you also get a certificate at the end. There's a course certificate if you finish the course. In case you will have some further questions about this course, you can always send me an email, right? My email address was indicated at the beginning. Well, we already sold it quite a couple of times worldwide, so you can let me know in case you would have questions, in case you would be interested. Always happy to address those. You can send me an email right here. This is my email address. Okay? So this finishes my short webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a couple of new things. Feel free to mail me, and I'm now ready to take some of your questions.
Thank you, Bart. There's a couple of questions here. Number one, in your presentation, you said that neural networks cannot be used for credit risk modeling since they are black box models. Have you seen other application areas where they're being used?
Yeah. For PD, LGD, and EAD modeling, neural networks are commonly not used. The reason is because, as you correctly mentioned, they're black box techniques, and credit risk models need to be white box because they're subject to supervisory review. I have seen neural networks quite recently being used in fraud analytics, for example. Fair Isaac, which is one of the big companies in the United States, provides credit scoring solutions, but they also provide fraud scoring solutions to monitor credit card transactions and see whether they're fraudulent, yes or no. Now, in fraud detection, you typically don't care whether you have a black box or white box model because you're so much focused on detecting fraud. For Isaac in the US, they have a system called Falcon, and Falcon is a system based upon neural networks to detect credit card fraud. Besides being used for credit card fraud, I've also seen neural networks being used in marketing settings, for example, for response modeling, to see whether somebody is likely to respond to a marketing campaign, yes or no. So they are being used in other settings, but not that much in credit risk modeling. Okay.
Thank you, Bart. And the second question, can you briefly summarize the main approaches to develop PD and LGD ratings?
Oh, that's a good one. I didn't have time to get into it in the webinar, but I'm gonna quickly give you the high-level overview. Basically, if you want to develop PD, LGD, or EAD ratings, there are two approaches that you can follow. The first approach is mapping onto an external rating agency. If you look at the rating agencies like Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch, they came up with rating scales themselves, right? With PD rating scales as well as with LGD rating scales. So what you could do is you could use those rating scales, map them against your internal application behavioral scores, and define your ratings in such a way that they as closely as possibly mimic those external ratings in terms of default rates. So mapping onto an external rating agency scale is the first approach of doing this. The second approach would be by using statistical methods. And a method that we have seen that is really very good in that respect is just a classification tree. And a classification tree with only two characteristics. The input of the classification tree is what we call the z-score. That's the output of the logistic regression. That's your credit score. And the output is a binary label specifying default, yes or no. You use a classification tree with a score as input and a 0-1 label as output. Classification trees are often used for that purpose. One very important thing that you should be aware of here is that your tree is monotonic. With monotonic, I referred to the fact that as the rating goes down, the default rate should increase. Every now and then, because of statistical fluctuations, you can have non-monotonic effects occurring. So if you would be using decision trees, it's very important to enforce that monotonic behavior. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Bart. And I think we've probably got time for just one more question. So are you aware of any statistical tests for backtesting that take into account default correlation?
Yeah, it's another good question. So well, let me briefly go through the tests that are being used for backtesting PD model calibration. There's a classical binomial test. Binomial test is going to test rating. Let me just go see where I can find my slide here. Let me just go quickly through the slides. Okay, here. This is the slide. So a binomial test is going to test every rating by rating individually. It's going to compare the estimated PD to the realized default rate using a binomial distribution. It's often used, and it has also, I know you're based in Hong Kong, at least I think in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority gave some positive reviews on using the binomial test. They even included some confidence levels. More specifically, they adopted confidence levels of 95 to 99.9%. So binomial test is one test, but it does not take into account default rate correlation. Another test is a Hausmer-Lemschow test, which is a high-score test, which is going to test all of them simultaneously. But again, it does not take into account default correlation. There's only one test which to the best of my knowledge takes into account default correlation, and that's the VASI-check test. The VASI-check test is a test which actually builds further upon the Basel model. I told you that the Basel model is a value at risk model. So it looks at the 99.9% worst case default rate using an asset correlation factor which has been fixed in the accord. Well, the same model, that VASI-check model, can also be used for backtesting. And here you can use the same asset correlations or default correlations, so both are related, for backtesting. And those default correlations, to give you an example, for mortgages they're being set to 15%, and for qualifying revolving exposures like credit cards, credit lines, they're being set to 4%. So yes, there exists some tests that do take into account default correlation. One of them is the VASI-check test.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bart. I hope you all enjoyed today's webinar for the credit risk community. It's been a pleasure. To view our upcoming events, jobs, career advice, and insightful blogs, please do visit www.morganmckinley.com or follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter at Morgan McKinley using hashtag #SuccessSeries and hashtag #CareerAlly. We look forward to hearing your feedback, and I hope you all have a pleasant day, morning, evening. Thank you very much.